Oh, anyway, I was going to ask you, like, do you about this Cold War thing, which concerns me greatly, uh, the where we seem to be heading. Are you concerned? You're probably more of a hawk than I am. Uh, Maybe both Russia hawk and China hawk. I don't know, but what's your take on all this?
Yeah, I'm definitely more hawkish than you.
Oh, so you've kept track of my Twitter output?
Yes. Well, that's what social media does. It allows you to follow a lot of people simultaneously. Yeah, I mean, especially with Ukraine, I personally and my center has done a lot of work in Ukraine ever since 2014. And we have lots and lots of Ukrainian friends. And, at one point, they captured a list of people that the Russians tried to take Kyiv in last February, March, and then they had to withdraw. And so they actually got a lot of captured Russian documents, and they actually had lists of all the people that they would have arrested if they had succeeded in taking the capital. And, a lot of our people were on it, and so it just seems to me that the moral cost of, this kind of aggression is going to be a really high one. So I've been very supportive of Ukraine. I mean, that's a whole separate discussion that we can get into about, the military situation and moral justifications and so forth. China, I think, is going to be a big problem because I do think that, any power that rises that quickly and gets that big is simply historically has always been a big problem for international systems to handle. And I guess the one thing that makes me a little bit less concerned is that Xi Jinping seems to be much less of a risk taker than Putin. I mean, Putin's just off the charts in terms of the stuff that he's willing to risk. I wrote my PhD dissertation actually on Soviet policy in the Middle East, and the basic thesis was that they would threaten to intervene, but they actually never did it. They'd always threaten after the peak of the crisis when they knew that they wouldn't have to carry through on the threat. So they're actually extremely cautious. They never introduced their own forces into the region or really any other region. Putin has just shot all that to hell. He's put troops in Syria and Venezuela, and
Well, Syria, but I mean, we probably shouldn't get too much into the nuts and bolts. He was invited in by the Syrian government. That's not like us invading Iraq.
But the Soviet Union was invited in too during the Cold War, and they just never agreed to do that. So there's just a level of risk taking in his case that has also, I think, been very self-destructive because he's taken these really crazy risks. The biggest one being invading Ukraine, and he's now paying a huge price, and that society is going to pay a continuing price, I think, really for generations.
Yeah, I think he's gotten less risk averse with time, and I'm very the invasion was a clear-cut violation of international law. I condemn it along with everyone else. The reason. One thing that shapes my whole reaction to it is my sad recognition that the U.S. has been a flagrant violator of international law. And for that reason, I think, in terms, it's not as if, I worry about the risks associated with trying to push Russia all the way out of Ukraine, just in terms of likelihood of nuclear war. But I also worry that it will not have nearly as much positive effect in terms of reinforcing the norm of respecting international law as it would have had if we had ourselves respected it. But I want to ask you, I also have this view that we kind of misplayed our hand over the last 25 years, and we could be living in a very different world that didn't have a Ukraine war if we hadn't. And I think that I want to ask you if you don't agree with some of that, because I remember, there was a conversation, this podcast, Nonzero, was previously I started this thing called, co-founded this thing called Blogging Heads TV that kind of evolved into this. I remember a conversation on that platform between you and Bob Kagan, And you were predicting at that point that what we had done in Kosovo, not just the military intervention, but we had just, I think, started to recognize Kosovo's independence. And by the way, that was, I think, most people would say, an illegal violation of international law. That intervention, at least I and a lot of people would say that. And you predicted that Putin would, exploit that, or that would make it more likely that he would start screwing around in Georgia, which he subsequently did. So I want to ask you, were you a critic of some of our early Russia policy, including NATO expansion, or not?
Well, look, I know you interviewed John Mearsheimer. I mean, John is an old friend and colleague of mine, but I think he's just been completely wrong, and he's been playing a very, very unhelpful role ever since the Russian invasion started. Yeah, I mean, I was not in favor of taking Georgia and Ukraine into NATO back in 2008 when Bush administration pushed that.
Okay.
It wasn't for the reasons, however, that John cites. It was really because I thought that, I started out as a military analyst at the Rand Corporation, and one of the things you know is that you can't support a military operation if you don't have the right military logistics. And it just seemed to me that it would be very, very difficult to actually defend Georgia and Ukraine. And Ukraine, at that time being, divided between a Russian-speaking East and a more Ukrainian West. Actually, right now, I'm completely in favor of taking Ukraine into NATO. I don't see how you're going to end this war if Ukraine doesn't actually become a member of NATO. But I think that the problem I had with Mearsheimer's argument is that he's completely oblivious to what Putin is actually saying. And of course, Putin has complained about NATO expansion and so forth, but the deeper arguments are so much broader than that. He thinks that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a huge tragedy. He thinks that the Slavic peoples, really have a destiny that includes the domination of all the weaker countries around him, and that was not driven by any kind of threat, from what's essentially a defensive alliance. It comes from his understanding of Catherine the Great and Peter the Great, and Russia's destiny as a Eurasian power. And so I think that. So I just think that there are so many other drivers of what Putin ended up doing that NATO expansion, it was imprudent. It gave him a good excuse. I guess this is the way I would put it. It gave him an excuse to do what he wanted to do anyhow, that has now become persuasive among a certain audience in the West, and therefore has weakened, the Western support for Ukraine. But I would agree with you that we made a lot of mistakes. I mean, the invasion of Iraq was a huge mistake. I think that one of the reasons that that Ukraine hasn't gotten as much support in the global South that we, or people like me, think it deserves is because of Iraq. Certainly in the Arab world, I've had Arab friends tell me that, look, you did the same thing in 2003, so why are we supposed to get so excited about Ukraine when you did it yourself? Now, I do believe that you can make both a moral and a political argument why these are two very different cases. Iraq was a really rapacious dictatorship, and Ukraine is a pretty good democracy. But I can appreciate the point that in terms of crossing international borders with military force, that was a terrible precedent to be set. And we've made certainly many other mistakes especially in the Middle East, because I just think that we don't know what we're doing in that region, that have weakened our position. But, Vietnam was a mistake too. I mean,
there have been a lot of mistakes. Yeah. Well, I don't want to, I kind of think Putin's, the worldview you described has, to some extent, evolved more than we appreciate. And the things he's saying that seem to go so far beyond a Mearsheimer world of just national security as a motivation, I think kind of got a lot more pronounced and crystallized, I think, in response to his perception that we kept heaping disrespect on him. But that's another argument there. I mean, it goes beyond NATO expansion in terms of the things he was unhappy with. But
thanks for watching Nonzero Clips. To hear more of this conversation and others like it, subscribe to the Nonzero YouTube channel or the Nonzero podcast feed. And to gain access to exclusive podcast content, subscribe to Robert Wright's Nonzero newsletter on Substack.